Okay, can everyone hear me at the back? Yeah, I sound loud in my own head, so this is good. So I would like to welcome you all on behalf of Studium Generale and the Centre for Philosophy, Politics and Economics at the University of Groningen, who collaborated to organise this talk tonight. My name is Charlotte Knowles, and I'm a philosopher here at the university. And it is my great pleasure to introduce Elizabeth Cripps. She is Senior Lecturer in Political Theory at the University of Edinburgh and Associate Director of Critique, the Centre for Ethics and Critical Thought. Elizabeth is a moral and political philosopher specialising in climate justice and parental duties. In 2022, she published a book with Bloomsbury, which I think we can see here, entitled What Climate Justice Means and Why We Should Care. And tonight she's going to talk to us about this very timely topic. So the programme for tonight will have a talk for about an hour from Elizabeth, and then we'll have about half an hour for questions, and we'll draw the evening to a close at 9:30. So, welcome, Elizabeth.
Thank you. Hello everyone, thank you very much for the invitation. It's wonderful to be here, and thank you for your very great courtesy in listening to a talk in English. I'm sorry that I'm not able to give it in Dutch. So I want to start by asking you to imagine that you're in a situation very different from the one that you're in now. So instead of being in this incredibly beautiful room, in this beautiful city in the global north, imagine that you are living on the shores of Bangladesh, in a village which is between the jungle and the sea. And there's been a cyclone. As a result of that, your village has been flooded, so the water is full of salt, it's undrinkable. Even worse, the barricade that there was to protect your village from the wild animals has been destroyed. So you know that a tiger could reach you and your family in your bamboo house at any time. 5 minutes, that's all it would take. So just for a moment, really try and imagine how it would feel to be in that situation. If you have children or elderly parents or other loved ones, imagine how it would feel for them to be in that situation. And then step back, be yourselves again, but be yourselves in relation to the people who are in situations like those, because that, what I just described, is a real situation. It happened. And there are many other people who are in that degree of danger and will be in the future because of climate change. So ask yourself, what do I owe them? Do I owe them anything? And that's the starting point for my book, and it's the starting point for my talk today. So can I just check? I'm getting a slight echo. Is anyone else getting that, or is it fine? Okay. Is it all right? Oh, some people are. Okay, good. Great, brilliant. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start by talking about climate injustice. So I'm going to talk about why the current situation, the situation we're in now, is fundamentally unjust. And then I'm going to talk about what climate justice might look like. But the first thing I want to do is say why I am wading into this debate at all. Why I think that it matters to talk about the moral issues here. Why, as a moral philosopher, I wanted to write this book. So you might just think, well, look, yes, climate change is terrible, but this is a political question, it's a scientific and technical and economic challenge. That's enough. Now, it is clearly all of those things, but fundamentally, climate change is a moral crisis, a moral emergency. And I think it's very important to be clear on that. And the reason why it matters so much, I think, is this. Because whatever policy choices we make, whatever our governments do, or more frequently don't do on climate change, whatever technology we decide to develop, that is making assumptions. Assumptions are being made about what takes priority, who to protect, what it's worth spending money on. Now, if we don't try and identify some clear moral basics and hold those decisions up against them, what happens? It's not that we have some kind of magical, value-free way of making decisions. No, what actually happens is that the so-called values, which are appealed to in making the decisions, end up being the interests of those who have the power and have the money. So it's incredibly important, I think, to have this as a debate about what's going on morally. So on that note, the first thing I want to say is that this isn't or shouldn't be philosophically or morally controversial. So climate change has become this massively polarized political debate. In countries like the US or my own UK, it's almost become a matter of what political party you support, whether you think we should be doing anything about climate change. But in fact, that shouldn't be the case. This shouldn't be about political ideology, whether you choose to think this is important or not. Because in fact, this is just about basic morality. So suppose we start off with pretty much the most uncontroversial moral principles that we can think of. Principles that on more or less any philosophical view, probably on more or less any kind of common sense view, people would accept. So the first one is this. It's wrong to do serious harm to another human being. It's wrong to kill somebody, it's wrong to maim them or make them sick or take away their home or their children. It just is. To put it another way, if anything is wrong, it's wrong to violate somebody's human rights. We can take that, I think, as a pretty uncontroversial starting point. It's sometimes known as the no harm principle. Another moral principle, which is almost as uncontroversial, says this. It says, if somebody else is suffering desperately and you can save them, and it would be very easy, or at least comparatively easy, for you to do so, then you should do that, just because you're a human being and so are they. Now, this isn't quite as universally shared, but it's still pretty uncontroversial. It's a mild version of what Peter Singer developed as his principle of beneficence. And he has this example. He says, well, suppose you were walking to work and you pass a pool and a child is drowning in it. You could save that child, but in the process you would ruin your new designer shoes. Should you save that child? It seems like an absolute moral no-brainer that of course you have to. The person who says no doesn't seem just to be disagreeing about what moral view is appropriate. They don't seem to subscribe to any meaningful morality altogether. I would say they're a sociopath. It is about as basic a moral principle as you can get. So let's start from those two ideas. If morality is about what we owe to one another as human beings, then justice is about how we should live together. And I think we can identify a very kind of rock-bottom minimum idea of what justice requires. So before we get to kind of questions about does justice require making everyone equally rich or equally happy or all those sorts of questions, we can say, well, an institution is not just, it's fundamentally unjust if it's violating rather than protecting people's human rights. An institution which is killing people is not a just institution. And that's all we need to say to identify climate change as fundamentally wrong or unjust. Because climate change, caused by people, some people, is destroying other people's lives. Now, we could talk in terms of the figures, and of course, the figures here are terrifying. The predictions of how many people will be harmed by climate change, the figures on numbers of people that will be displaced by it or who have already lost their lives or their homes. But actually, I think when we talk about the numbers, there's a danger of forgetting something fundamentally important, which is that each of those numbers is a human being who has their own life, their own interests, their own dreams, their own people that they care about. So instead, I just want to start by kind of mentioning a few more of the real-life examples of the victims of climate change. So the little boy, one of the many in that UNICEF report, the 11-year-old boy who lost his home, his school, and also his 8-year-old best friend in the floods that were caused, or the sort of floods that are made worse by climate change in Bangladesh. Or the 5-year-old girl, again, this is a true story, the 5-year-old girl whose family lost their livelihood because of the droughts that made farming so difficult, and whose parents, desperate for money, ended up contracting for her to marry a man who was 30 years older than her. These are the kind of things that become more likely because of climate change. Or consider the couple with their baby in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina, who had been driven from a refuge where they tried to take shelter by the fact that there was looting, and ended up floating around the city on an inflatable mattress that they were having to use as a raft with their baby. Now, these are horrible stories, but they are true stories, and I tell them to make exactly that point, to remind ourselves that what is happening is that climate change is destroying people's lives, and that is only going to get worse in terms of future generations. So this, it seems to me, is a clear-cut moral wrong. If anything is unjust, this is. But not everyone agrees. So here are some of the excuses that might be made. The reasons that people might reject this line of argument is too simplistic. So one thing that might be said is, yeah, but you're relying on climate science, and the climate science is still up for debate. Now, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because the climate science is not really up for debate. The IPCC has made it clear since 1990 that it is happening. Every single IPCC report is more unequivocal that climate change is extremely bad, that we have a relatively limited window to tackle it, and that it's caused by human beings. Back in 2009, a couple of social scientists surveyed thousands of scientists, including a number of climate science specialists. And among the climate science specialists, 97% of them agreed that climate change, anthropogenic climate change, is real. So the science is not really in doubt. The reason that there is doubt in the public debate is that that doubt has been deliberately manufactured. It's been created as a product, a very lucrative product, by those who have a vested interest in maintaining fossil fuels. So obviously fossil fuel companies, actually also big meat and dairy firms have played a role in this, but also some politicians and a handful of corrupt scientists. And essentially there's been a deliberate campaign to create and maintain doubt. And the social scientific evidence on that is as compelling and frankly almost as terrifying as the scientific evidence on climate change itself. So the next sort of two excuses go together, and they start off with this idea that, well, justice is something that we owe to people that we're relatively close to, right? That we share a state with. So the idea would be, well, I don't pay my taxes to protect people far off in the world or in distant generations. Justice is something that you owe within your states, and climate change is primarily affecting people in distant parts of the world or in future generations. Now, to start off with, that's actually clearly practically wrong. Climate change is primarily and especially affecting the global south and will affect future generations. But actually, if you think about things like the wildfires that we've seen in recent years, climate change is clearly already affecting places in the global north, states like this as well, and it will affect our children who are already alive. So this is not just a matter of distant strangers. But even if it was, this excuse depends, I think, on a model of justice which I'm not referring to here. So we could say, as I said, there are arguments that justice requires equality of opportunity, and then there's a kind of corresponding argument that says, well, that kind of justice is something you only owe to people that you're in a certain institutional relationship with, such as that in the nation state. And actually, we could say, well, even that's not convincing because now we have interconnected institutions and global trade. Actually, maybe we are in that kind of relationship globally. But we don't even need to say that, because actually the kind of justice I'm talking about here isn't that kind of stronger notion of justice. It's a kind of bare minimum level of justice which says, look, it's wrong for institutions to kill people rather than to protect them. And it's wrong to do serious harm to somebody else, wherever they are in the world. It doesn't change that they're not in the same country as you. Similarly, with future generations, it might be argued that actually we owe future generations more than just not doing them the serious harm or protecting them from it. It might be said that we owe future generations the same standard of living that we have. And the idea could be, well, okay, we're not in the same reciprocal kind of relationship with future generations as we are with people that live now, but there is a sense in which we can reciprocate the benefits, the good things we get from past generations by handing them down. But again, we don't even need to say that to see that something's going wrong here, because we're talking about a failure to protect even basic rights for future generations here. We're talking about undermining, violating those basic rights. And then again, it just doesn't seem plausible that we wouldn't have those moral duties to future generations. So Henry Shue has a really good example here. He says, look, suppose I feel like going out and planting a landmine for fun. I think it would be an exciting thing to do. So I go and put this mine on some incredibly popular tourist trail, and I plant it so it'll go off tomorrow. Now, I don't know who's going to be harmed or killed by this. I don't even know for sure, but anybody will be. But it's pretty likely that my action is going to do serious harm to somebody. Clearly, that is wrong. Okay, says Henry Shue, so suppose that I plant that landmine to go off in 100 or 150 years' time. So the person who is killed by that cannot possibly be alive today. Does that make it okay to do that? Seems clearly that it doesn't. At least some of our responsibilities extend to future generations. And that's all we need to accept to see that climate change is a fundamental injustice. Now, there's another reason that might be given for saying that what we're doing isn't harming or wronging future generations, which is a philosophical objection which, in my experience, non-philosophers just find either ridiculous or slightly frustrating. But I'm going to touch on it now for the benefit of the philosophers in the room. And that's what's called the non-identity problem. So this is a line of argument that says, well, you can't say that climate change is harming any individual future person. Because if we acted now concertedly to tackle climate change, those individual people wouldn't exist. So take some future person born in 2080, call her, I don't know, Jane, and can we say that Jane has been harmed if we fail to act on climate change now? Well, no, on this argument, because suppose we do act on climate change, policies change radically, people's lives change radically, people do different things and meet different people. So it's very possible that Jane's great-grandparents won't even meet each other. It's incredibly unlikely that they would conceive a child at exactly the time that they do under current circumstances. So the people who are born into the next generations are different. So on this argument, it says, well, look, Jane is no worse off than she would have been otherwise. You haven't made Jane worse off because the alternative was her not existing at all. The same goes for all individuals in future generations. So how are we harming them? What are we doing wrong? Now, I think the first thing to say about that objection is that the consequences of taking it seriously are just so extreme that in themselves are a reason not to take it seriously. You could do pretty much anything to future individuals, so long as you didn't make their lives not worth living at all, and in the process you changed which individuals were being born. So you could have children just to use them for scientific experiments, for example. So clearly the consequences of that are very problematic anyway. But there are also quite a lot of philosophical ways around it. So we could point out, for example, that actually you can wrong somebody without making them worse off overall. You can violate someone's rights, even if you, in the process, actually make them better off. So there's some nice examples in the philosophical literature that, imagine an eccentric billionaire starts dropping cages full of gold coins onto the ground, and one falls on somebody and they get all the money, but their arm is broken. Now, they've been wronged because their arm's been broken, but overall, arguably, they're better off. We could also point out that maybe existence isn't a benefit in the way that should be kind of ranked against other harms and benefits. Or we could say, well, look, when we think about future generations, we shouldn't really be thinking about individuals. We either think about what we owe future generations as a group, or we say, well, actually, it's about what we owe to whoever happens to be in the position of being in that future generation. It's not about owing it to Jane in particular. In exactly the same way that we could say, well, I have certain responsibilities to my daughters, but I don't just have those responsibilities because they are themselves, those two incredibly special to me individuals whom I happen to give birth to. It would be whichever children I had happened to have would be the people that I had those responsibilities to. So I think we can avoid or evade this philosophical objection. And then there is a last excuse, which is probably one of the most common ones, which says, well, okay, this is happening. It is a huge problem, but it's not my problem as an individual, because I'm not causing it. This is being caused by governments, by fossil fuel firms. This is perhaps a few very rich individuals, but this is not something that I can be said to be causing as an individual. I'm not responsible. Now, to some extent, I completely agree with this, right? The real villains here are governments and fossil fuel companies. So the 20 biggest fossil fuel companies were responsible for 35% of global emissions between, I think it was 1965 and 2000 and something. I can't remember the exact year, but over that period. And governments continue to subsidize fossil fuels. So they are clearly the real villains. But that doesn't mean that individuals don't have any moral connection to what's going on. We are, if we live in countries like this in the global north, we are citizens of the governments which are making those decisions. We are voters. We are often shareholders. Anyone who has a pension is a shareholder, and too often those pensions are actually shareholders in fossil fuel firms. We are customers or consumers of those corporations. So we are connected to those harms. We are playing a part knowingly in those structures that cause the harm, that cause climate change. That doesn't mean that any one of us is individually to blame, unless the CEO of Shell is in the room, and then I will make an exception for them. But I don't think any of us individually are to blame. But the point is that we can still have shared responsibilities to act together to remedy harms that we've caused together, or harms that we could, by acting together, remedy. So yes, you may not think it's my problem, but it is undoubtedly our problem. So climate change is a fundamental injustice. It's a violation of human rights because of the actions of other people. But these harms do not fall equally. They are not caused by us equally, and it's not coincidence that they fall in the way that they do. So climate change serves to exacerbate existing historical injustices, particularly race and gender injustices. So according to figures from Oxfam, the richest 10% of people in the world are responsible for 52% of carbon emissions. The richest 1% are responsible for more than twice as many carbon emissions as the poorest half of people in the world. This is not being equally caused. And that richest 1% and richest 10% are predominantly white, predominantly male, predominantly in the global north. At the same time, the harms caused by climate change are falling hardest and fastest on the global south. And within states, they also tend to fall hardest and fastest on those who are already in oppressed or marginalized groups. So communities of color, black communities, indigenous communities, women are worse hit by climate change than men. And this is happening for a reason. It's not coincidence. It's happening because climate change is inseparable from a pattern of historical injustice. So suppose, for example, that we think again about Hurricane Katrina. An incident is some extreme weather event, which is exactly the kind of thing which is being made worse by climate change. But the harms from Hurricane Katrina did not fall neutrally, as it were, across the citizens of New Orleans. It was predominantly black citizens who were harmed. Now, so were some attempts in the media afterwards to say, well, no, that's not true. It's just that there happened to be more black people living in New Orleans, and that was why there were more black victims of the hurricane. So a few years afterwards, a Harvard social scientist called Patrick Sharkey did some number crunching where he actually compared the figures, so the proportions of the citizens of New Orleans that were black, and then he compared it with the number of victims, either who had been killed or gone missing, who were black, and he found in both cases, killed and gone missing, it was the black community who were disproportionately affected. So the proportion who had been killed, who were black, and the proportion who had gone missing, who were black, were higher than the original proportions in the population. And this is not hard to understand or to see why. It's because the black communities tended to live in areas of the city that were poorer and more vulnerable to the floods. They also often had fewer resources with which to escape. Why would that be the case? Well, in a former slave state like Louisiana, unfortunately, we don't need to look very far to see why that would be the case. We look back through the history of racial discrimination, through the Jim Crow laws, all the way back to slavery, and we see a pattern of historical injustice which has left one marginalized community particularly vulnerable to this new set of harms. So climate change ends up exacerbating that existing injustice. Similarly, with women, it's not because women are biologically more vulnerable to climate change that more women are harmed. It's because of social structures that make women more vulnerable. And this can be something as simple as an example from a UN report that women and girls are more likely to be killed in extreme weather events like floods because women and girls are less likely to be taught to climb or to swim. So that these climate change is exacerbating these existing harms. And it also does so in a way which philosophers call intersectional. So there are some people who are in more than one oppressed or marginalized group who are worse off in a way that we cannot properly understand just by thinking about it in big category terms like race and gender. So women of color, for example, are particularly hit by climate change, and policies which focus on either race or gender could easily fail to protect them. This is a point made by the philosopher Kimberly Crenshaw. They can easily fail to protect them because they end up either protecting white women or men of color. And actually, this doesn't just apply to race and gender, it also applies across various other marginalized and oppressed groups. So, for example, sexual orientation or disability are also categories which tend to end up with people being worse off or worse harmed by climate change. And again, this is because of existing social injustices. So, for example, the queer and trans community in Jamaica were much more likely to be seriously harmed by recent extreme weather there because that community had essentially been ostracized and was forced to be living outside the city in areas that were particularly vulnerable. The other point to make, of course, is that at the same time as climate change worsening these existing injustices, making things worse for these communities, they are also being denied a say in the decision making. So precisely those people who are most marginalized, who are most vulnerable to climate change, are also not getting a say in what we're doing about climate change, either at a national or at a global level. And ironically, they are often the people who would have the most useful insights or who show most potential to lead at grassroots level. So an example of this is that you probably will all remember this from a few years ago at the Davos Economic Forum in 2020. The bottom picture was taken of the Ugandan climate activist Vanessa Nakate with a number of other young climate activists, including Greta Thunberg. The news agency took the bottom photo, but it circulated the top one. It cut Vanessa out of the photo. Now, after there was a great outcry about this on social media, the news agency said that it was an honest mistake. Whether or not that is the case, this was unfortunately extremely representative in the way in which voices of colour, women's voices, and particularly the voices of women of colour, of these young black girls like Vanessa Nakate, are essentially being excluded from decision making. So the third aspect that I want to touch on in talking about climate injustice before I move on to the slightly more positive aspect of climate justice is non-humans. So climate change isn't just bad for us. It's bad, devastatingly bad, for non-humans. So the little creature on the left there is the bramble case melamis, which is, or was, an Australian animal which became the first mammal to go extinct because of climate change. According to the IPCC, with only 2 degrees centigrade of warming, then up to a third of species in the Amazon would go extinct. And as the global warming increases, that number just gets higher and higher. So climate change is destroying species and ecosystems, but it's also doing devastating harm to individual animals. So the picture on the right of the koala is a reminder of the devastating suffering that was inflicted on Australian wildlife by the bushfires a few years ago. Now, as a moral philosopher who's also done some work on justice and non-humans, I'm pretty happy to pin my colours to the mast and say, I think this matters in itself. I think this is a moral wrong. So there are many arguments to make the point that actually non-humans are entitled to moral consideration, particularly mammals whose levels of sentience and whose capacity for suffering make it pretty much impossible for us to draw a clear dividing line between humans and non-humans and say we shouldn't be protecting them. There are also plenty of arguments to show or suggest that we should worry that it's a moral wrong or even an injustice in itself if species or ecosystems are being destroyed. I'm happy to say that. I think they matter in themselves. But actually, you don't even need to accept that to see that this is a huge problem, that this is an inseparable aspect of climate injustice. So one way of pointing this out is to make the obvious point, but one that seems to have been forgotten by societies in the global north who've essentially kind of dissociated themselves from and commoditized the non-human world, is that we are all part of these ecosystems. We depend on them for our survival. So if the Amazon is being destroyed, yes, it is a destruction of an incredibly intricate and beautiful and valuable ecosystem. It is the destruction of many species and individual lives. But it's also the destruction of something on which we all depend for our survival as a species. Another point which has been made, and I think is very important, is that when we think about the injustices done to humans, actually, arguably, they go hand in hand with, they're inseparable from, the injustices done to non-humans. So this is a point that the ecofeminists make. They say, well, actually, if you look at the historic patterns of oppression through which generally people of colour and women have been exploited or oppressed or treated as means to an end, it's exactly the same patterns and processes which have seen the non-human world being dominated and treated as a commodity. So these two are actually inseparable from one another. And a number of philosophers recently, as well as some activists, have argued that actually we need to take an intersectional approach to justice and think about multi-species justice as the way of moving forward in the face of climate change. So on that note, let's move on to thinking about climate justice. So this is a moral wrong. It's an injustice. What would it look like if we could wave a magic wand and have all the global negotiators agree on the most just way forward now? Unfortunately, that's not likely to happen, especially given the location of the next COP, but let's just assume for a moment it would. What would this look like? Well, clearly, it would require mitigation. It requires mitigation because the science is absolutely clear that 1.5 degrees C is the absolute maximum that we can have without fundamental devastation, without completely undermining any kind of justice for future generations. But mitigation alone would not be enough to protect people. Climate change is already and will continue to do huge harms. So large parts of Africa are already suffering hugely with 1.5 degrees C. We've already seen extreme weather events in all parts of the world, including floods and wildfires. So adaptation is needed. So an adaptation is essentially changes to infrastructure to protect people from some degree of global warming. So everything from flood defenses to new ways of farming. There are all sorts of ways in which adaptation has to take place, but crucially, it needs to protect the most vulnerable communities, especially from climate change. The third thing, which is also required now, is compensation, because there are, whatever progress is made now, and however quickly on mitigation and adaptation, there are going to be some people, some communities who have already lost something fundamental. So sadly, an example looks like being the small island states. If they lose their country, those people have lost something that can't be replaced. They have lost a fundamental interest. That can't be fully made up for. But at the very least, they are owed some kind of compensation to try and get as close to making up for it as possible. So climate justice involves all those three things. And as we've just touched on a plausibly extended view, it also requires protecting non-humans from such climate change as we are going to have. So we need all this. That gives rise to two kind of key questions. Who's going to pay for it all? And who decides what exactly we do? Now, actually, the kind of political moral philosophy here, we have a pretty reasonable consensus, I would say, on those who work on this. It's just that, as I'll talk about in a minute, it's a very long way from where we are in practice. But let's sort of think about four kind of key ideas that we seem to, that makes sense to draw on when we're thinking about this question, who should pay? So the first one is the no harm principle, right? The principle I started with. So if we say it's wrong to do serious harm, then we say those who are polluting, those who are emitting fossil fuels, should be picking up the tab here. That's the polluter pays idea. Second moral principle says if you are rich, whether you're a corporation, a government, or an individual, and you can help the victims of climate change, which you can do relatively easily because you're rich, then you should. So we have the second idea, but the rich, or those who are able to, should bear the costs. Then there's another idea, which relies on a slightly less uncontroversial, but still pretty widely shared moral idea, and that's the idea of fairness. So this comes up when we think about historic emissions. So people who are alive now in a country like this, or the UK, or the US, a lot of the harm that our country did through climate change was done before we were born. Some of it was even done before it was realized that this was causing harm. The carbon emissions happened before we realized it was harmful. So why should this generation, the argument goes, pick up the tab? Why should people in this country be paying extra costs because of things that their ancestors did? And this is where the idea of fairness comes in, because this argument says, well, okay, but now we know the situation. That means that we know that we are living the lives we are living with all the benefits and advantages we have because of processes which have also caused severe harm to other people. So we know that essentially we are free riding, this is how Axel Gosseries puts it, we're free riding on the harms to them. If we're not prepared to pay our fair share now, we're essentially saying, well, we're not prepared to do our bit, to do what's fair in bearing the costs of the things that we benefit from. So that's the kind of beneficiary pays principle, as it's called. A fourth idea, which Henry Shue stresses, and again, which is intuitively very strong, is this idea that whoever pays, it shouldn't be those who are already desperately vulnerable. So it shouldn't be people who would be pushed below the point of having a decent life at all by doing this. So Henry Shue has a great line, which I quote in my book, and I'm going to paraphrase it now, but it's more or less, whatever justice requires, it doesn't require that the poor have to pawn their blankets so that the rich can keep their jewels. And this is particularly important when we think about the need to have a just transition away from fossil fuels, because there are some people who are extremely vulnerable in terms of their dependence at the moment on fossil fuels. So this could be people in the global south who are having to burn fossil fuels in order to be able to cook their food, or it could be low-paid workers in oil and gas in a country like the UK. In both those cases, justice wouldn't require that they have to pay the costs of the transition. So clearly mitigation requires a move away from fossil fuels, but a just approach has got to incorporate others bearing the costs so that those people have an alternative source of fuel or retraining and new jobs. And these principles, these ideas can be combined. So Simon Caney, the philosopher, has suggested a version whereby we combine them all and we say, well, polluters pay to tackle climate change, except if they're very poor. They pay even if they didn't know they were causing harm, if they're benefiting from that harm. And the rich pay the rest, especially if their wealth was gained from injustice in the past. And Caney says, well, that doesn't just mean that it could be wealth that came from fossil fuels, it could be wealth that came about in all sorts of other unjust ways. So, for example, wealth that was gained through colonialism. And that makes sense given the inseparability of these different injustices. So we have, broadly speaking, I think, agreement among sort of philosophers who think about this, ethicists who think about this, that this is what a fair division of the costs would look like. But of course, there's also a question of, well, how do we apply this in practice? How do we make these decisions? And this is where it becomes particularly crucial to think about participatory justice. So justice requires that those people who have most at stake, and by most at stake, I don't just mean they have lots of shares in the companies doing the harm. What I mean is most at stake is those who are most vulnerable to climate change, who actually have their basic needs and interests at stake, should actually have a meaningful seat at the decision-making table. So that means in communities and governments that minorities are represented in making these decisions. At the global level, it means giving the global south a much bigger say in decision-making than they currently have. So that's what climate justice would look like. But unfortunately, that's not where we are. It's a very long way from where we are. So think for a moment about the Paris Agreement, which is the best we currently have in terms of climate change, action on climate change. Think about it just in terms of mitigation. So it is absolutely clear that we need to keep climate change down to 1.5 degrees to avoid extreme injustice. There's a group called Climate Action Tracker who have done some calculations looking at states' commitments and comparing them with showing what reductions in temperature they would actually lead to. And according to the round of figures that came after the Glasgow COP, which essentially, if if all states do everything that they have said they would, so not just the things they've actually pledged to do or their policies, but all their long-term targets as well, then we could get down to 1.8 degrees. In terms of the nationally determined contributions, so the commitments that states have made within the UNFCCC framework, that would get us down to 2.4. In terms of states' actual policies, we're looking at 2.7 degrees C, so frighteningly high. And that's before we even start to think about how far the Paris Agreement falls short of adequate funding for adaptation globally or for compensation. And perhaps it's not that surprising that we've ended up with this, given the way that decisions are made in that process. So this is not a transparent, globally representative decision-making process. This is, in fact, a process of behind closed doors diplomacy with lots of last-minute, high-stakes bargaining, where often only a few players actually knew what was going to happen until the very last minute. And it tends to be the wealthiest states, the ones who can afford to bring the most negotiators, who get most of the decisions in their favour. So this is not participatory justice either. So where do we go from here? Essentially, we are in a situation where some major players, so very wealthy states and fossil fuel companies, some individuals, are refusing to do what they should to tackle climate change. Where does that leave the rest of us? It leaves everyone else in the situation of having to make trade-offs, having to decide between often lesser evils. So having to work out whether and how far it's possible to try and persuade or cajole those major players or force them if necessary into changing their behavior. And often having to make compromises in order to do that. So to consider options like that end up putting more costs on those who really shouldn't be bearing costs because they're more vulnerable, or who that end up basically trying to pass on the costs of mitigation to future generations, or policies that end up with more harms to the non-human world than would be necessary if all these major players were actually doing what they should. So this becomes a process of what philosophers call non-ideal justice, of trying to kind of work through these less evil options. Does that mean then that actually, although I've said this is a major moral crisis and that we really need a moral framework, at this point do we have to just say, but ultimately it's going to be a matter for political compromise. People aren't going to live up to the moral rules, so we just step back as moral philosophers and leave it to politics to work a way out. I really don't think that is the right response, because the fact that we are now in a situation where even those who are motivated to act on climate change are having, because of the refusal of others, to make these difficult moral choices, the fact that we're in that situation makes it more important rather than less to identify some basic moral don't cross lines, to hang on to some key moral ideas. For example, when it comes to making these difficult trade-offs, it seems that we have to hang on to human rights as an absolute fundamental, we don't cross that line. It also becomes more important than ever that those who are already the victims of climate change, those who are already exploited or oppressed, are actually listened to, who often have already shown considerable leadership skills in this, that they are actually given the seat at the decision-making table, because otherwise it will tend to be precisely those groups who are the victims of those compromises and trade-offs. So even in this extremely non-ideal situation, I think we do have to hang on to the moral basics. But where does this leave me or you as an individual, right? For many people, that's the question. You feel tiny and powerless and lost in the face of this just refusal to act by governments and corporations. So what should we do? What can we do? Well, I think, given that this is a fundamentally collective crisis, the most important thing you can do as an individual, the priority as an individual, is to cooperate with other people, other motivated people, to change what happens at the collective level, to become politically active, to change what corporations do, to work together. The reason I think this has to be the priority, rather than just trying to change our own lives and cut our own carbon footprint, is for three reasons. One is it's fairer, because if it's left to individuals to make all the changes, then some people will be bearing much heavier costs than others. It's also much more efficient, because actually it's very difficult to change one's own lives and cut carbon if it's not happening at a collective level. So if there's no public transport system, then it is extremely difficult and expensive to not have a car. If vegan food is way more expensive or hard to get hold of, then it's much harder to go vegan, whereas if these changes are made collectively, it's much easier and more efficient per person. But actually, the sort of all-consuming fundamental reason for prioritizing trying to bring about collective change is that otherwise it's just impossible to solve the problem, right? This cannot be solved by individuals alone. This needs collective action. Mitigation needs collective action. And then if you think about the sort of projects and processes that are needed for adaptation, and the fact that we need that in a country like this, our responsibility is going to be to fund and secure adaptation in more vulnerable parts of the world, that's not something that an individual can do on their own. So effectively, because this is a shared duty in the face of a collective crisis, the first thing we need to be doing is cooperating to promote change. Now, that doesn't mean that cutting our own carbon footprint is completely irrelevant. In fact, I think it does have an important role to play. It can be important because if it's something that we can do alongside fighting for political change, it's a way of not being so much of a part of the harm. But it's also important because actually this can be an effective means of promoting change. It's one way, it's not the only way, but it's one way we can bring about change, either because there is evidence that as some people make a change, others are likely to follow. People will imitate their peers in this respect. But also because that can then send a signal to corporations to change what they do, which in turn can prompt more people to change. So if you think about the vegan movement, for example, as more people shifted to eating more plant-based food, then corporations, supermarkets start providing more, restaurants open up with vegan restaurants or more restaurants offer vegan options. In turn, more people turn vegan or eat less meat because it's easier. And also, doing this can be a way of sending a signal to governments that we would be prepared to accept a policy change to make it the norm. So changing your own lifestyle matters, but it's not the only thing. And that leaves me with just one more final excuse or concern to consider. And that is the argument that says, well, okay, but I am just one person. And whether we're talking about me turning down the heating or going on a march, it's not actually going to make any difference. I mean, yes, we need to do a lot, but I'm not going to make a difference. So, for example, why should I have got the train here rather than flown here, which turned out to be a bit of a disaster because it took 12 hours from London to Utrecht? Why should I have made all that effort when, it doesn't seem to make any difference at the collective level? Why should I go on a march when it's freezing cold and raining in Scotland when it feels like one extra person isn't going to change things? Well, I think the first thing to think about is the fact that this is a collective crisis, so we do have to think in terms not of what I can do, but of what we can do, and motivate ourselves as part of that, as part of the kind of groups which are acting to bring about change here. But there are also sort of philosophical arguments that kind of get at this objection in more detail. So one way of thinking about it is to say, well, okay, you might not make a difference, you probably won't, but there's a small chance you'll make a very big difference. And small chances of big differences overall give you reason to take action. So we can think about this in terms of carbon emissions. Yes, if you decide to give up your car, it may not make any difference, but at some point, as carbon emissions increase, things get worse. An extreme weather event could get triggered. There's a chance that your decisions could be the ones that trigger that change. There's a small chance of you causing very great harm. Equally, at some point, if a march gets big enough, politicians will start taking notice of it. Maybe a new bill will be introduced. Perhaps you'll be the pivotal person that causes that. So that's one way of thinking about it. Another way of thinking about it, suggested by the philosopher Julianevsky, says, well, okay, even if you don't make a difference, it matters that you can help to do good. So it matters that you are part of a group. It's not yet decided whether the outcome is going to be good or bad, and you are part of the group of people who could, between them, make a difference. That matters. That should motivate, Julianevsky says, because you can help to do good. Or another way of thinking about it comes back to this idea of fairness. So this is a point that the philosopher Garrett Cullity makes. This is a collective or shared duty. It's something that we morally should be doing. If you don't do your bit and leave it to other people, then essentially, in a sense, you are morally free-riding. You're not doing your fair share. So there are a number of philosophical and moral reasons we can say that actually we shouldn't be stymied by this I make no difference concern. We can step past that as individuals and focus instead on what you and others can do together, and think about the most effective way that you can be part of that collective effort. So to summarize, I've tried to show that climate change is a fundamental, uncontroversially fundamental injustice, and one which worsens existing injustices. I've tried to indicate what climate justice would look like by showing that it would require the burdens, the costs of mitigation, adaptation, and compensation to be borne by polluters and by the rich. And I have tried to show how the fact that we are very far from that in practice doesn't mean that we should throw away the idea of morality altogether. And as for individuals, my conclusion, my message in short version is that we absolutely all need to be activists now. So I will leave you with that. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you, Elizabeth, for a very inspiring and interesting talk. We have half an hour for questions, and we have quite a big audience. So please do keep your questions precise and to the point, and make sure that they are questions and not just a long, rambling statement. So Annalise will come round with the microphone, and if you put your hands up if you have a question, we can direct them to you. Who wants to go first? Go on. Someone be brave.
You made a case for partaking in activism, and for the last 30, 40 years there has been a lot of protests and so on, and you have been talking about this this climate injustice. Do you think we are allowed or we are justified to protest against unjust laws by participating in, for example, civil disobedience? And do you think it's a good idea to go to The Hague on the 27th of May
I don't know
with Extinction Rebellion?
I don't know what's happening at The Hague on the 22nd of May, but do please fill me in on that. Yes, broadly speaking, I do think civil disobedience is completely justified here. In fact, I wrote an article on that for The Guardian a while ago because, yeah, I mean, this seems absolutely an instance where the government is failing to keep its part of the social contract. The government is not protecting people in other states and future generations. It's also not protecting her own children and young people right now. And the reason, to some extent, that the government is owed our obedience to laws is because it, in return, provides that protection. I mean, that's kind of broadly speaking, the kind of standard philosophical defense of civil disobedience, and this seems a case where that is clear-cut. I would, however, draw a very firm line between peaceful and violent civil disobedience, but the case for peaceful civil disobedience, absolutely, yes.
Okay, any more questions? Hands up. Yeah, at the back.
Good evening. My name is Bas, amongst others a PPE student. I saw online that we have something in common. Thanks so much for this interesting talk. I wondered what your views on this historical responsibility principle are with regards to how it extends to prioritizing adaptation measures. So, for example, the Netherlands is a country below sea level. At some point, we'll have to raise the dikes as well. However, there are island states currently being flooded. Should we, as the Netherlands, being partly responsible for this problem, historically speaking, basically be screwed, in a sense, by prioritizing others?
I think what I would say is that as a comparatively wealthy state in the global sense, and as a state which, yes, is one of those in the global north which is responsible for past emissions, it would be much harder to show that the Netherlands had any kind of claim on other countries to support their adaptation efforts. Does that mean that they shouldn't be enabling adaptation themselves in order to provide adaptation aid elsewhere? That doesn't necessarily follow, because it seems perfectly possible that a wealthy state could do both.
Okay, anyone else? Yeah.
Thank you for your talk. My name is Michiel Berger. I'm a lecturer at this university. I was brought up and born in this country. And I was also raised and also educated with the idea that we live in a wealthy state and it's very well organized, and that is mostly due to our own, let's say, efforts. And I think that idea is basically wrong. At least, well, significantly part of that. Because I think in this state, a significant part of our wealth is due to, well, all the historical colonialism for ages.
Yes.
And I think there will be calculations that about 20% of our BNP in the past was due to slavery and colonialism. But that idea, that notion that we have a debt, actually, as a country to, for instance, a continent like Africa or other continents, is not really sunk in to, I think, most of the inhabitants of this country. So if that would be, let's say, part of our education and upbringing, I suppose we would have a completely different position towards helping others in the rest of the world. So I think, well, something in our education system is wrong, but I'm not sure how we could change that easily. Politicians do not seem too eager to change that, nor are companies. They stress how magnificent we ourselves are.
So I think you're right that there is often that attitude by wealthy states, and also actually of individuals who've done well in wealthy states. It's amazing how often you will find, rich, sorry to stereotype, but rich white men saying, "Oh, but I got where I am by working really hard." And you'll be like, "Well, yes, but you also had your private school fees paid, and then you went to a really expensive university, and also then you had all the other privileges that go with being white and being male." So, it doesn't actually seem that straightforward. So yes, we see that both at the individual and at the state level. I completely agree with you. And I also agree with you that it's going to be very hard to change. But I think you yourself just indicated one of the ways in which it could change is through education. Thinking about the education that we give our children, and thinking about introducing the idea of citizenship at more of a global level. So not just the idea of being a good citizen of this country, but what it means to be a good global citizen. I think that should be an important part of education. And yes, I mean, the governments aren't changing at the moment, or aren't changing in any way fast enough, and nor are the corporations. But this, I guess, is where we come back to the point, well, as individuals, as citizens of that country, as voters, in our case, if like me, you're a lecturer, as educators, we can't then just say, well, the fact that they're not doing it is the end of the story. This is where we have to, as citizens, get involved, protest it in all sorts of different ways, use the influence we have to try and bring about that change. And yes, I agree, it's absolutely not going to be easy. And there is also, there are significant psychological obstacles to overcome, the way that we learn to kind of think short term and value things in terms of just their economic worth and treat the natural world as a commodity. There are all sorts of ways of thinking that we've learned in the global north, which we will need to try and unlearn. So it's definitely going to be hard, but it's also incredibly necessary, I think.
Okay, anyone else? Yeah, at the front here, and then.
Three questions. Yeah. Hi, thank you for your talk. I was wondering to what extent should we hold our peers responsible for actions which might not be very beneficial to stopping climate change, and because it's not usually a normal part of discourse or discussion.
So sorry, you mean to what extent we should hold our peers responsible in the sense, the extent to which we should tell them that we think they're responsible, or just in...
So maybe somebody has an action which is detrimental to climate change. Should we then tell them this is wrong? Should we convince them of changing their actions or their statements? Or
Okay, good. So I mean, actually, what you've sort of brought out is that there is to some extent a difference between the moral arguments to show why something's wrong and the most effective ways to get people to change. And actually, often kind of haranguing people, especially like on a day-to-day social situation, is just going to annoy them, right? It's not necessarily going to get them to change. So yes, there are opportunities. I think that this is, and Catherine Hayhoe, who's a climate scientist and expert in climate communication, she says, look, we just need to talk about climate change all the time, but connect it to things that people already care about, kind of link it up with something that already matters to them. So she says when she's talking to Twitchers, bird watchers, for example, she will sort of point to the destruction in bird species through climate change. She'll sort of hinge on to something that already matters to them and start there. There's also, and this is one of the reasons why individual lifestyle changes can really matter, is that kind of setting an example oneself can be a more effective way to persuade those who are immediately around you to change. So yes, there's an important role for kind of speaking out and protesting, but does that mean, every time your friend tells you that they just went on holiday on a long-haul flight, you say, oh, you're a terrible person? No, I don't think that would be the most effective way, probably, of doing it. I think the other thing I would also add on that is, of course, precisely because our individual choices are constrained by the collective decision, it's often sort of unfair to blame people completely for what they can't help. If somebody is commuting to work by car and there's no public transport system, yes, they'll have a high carbon footprint, but it's hard to hold them fully responsible for that.
Hi, my name is Iris. Thank you for your interesting talk.
Thank you.
I'm kind of missing one of the excuses that I hear a lot, and that's there's so many things that you could do, like to be more environmental friendly, that are later sort of debunked. So, for example, but soy is bad to our environment too, or greenwashing of companies, and I feel like this is a reason why a lot of people get sort of overwhelmed by how they should do this. And I wonder how you view this in this context of individual responsibility and morality.
Good. So I suppose the first thing is, yes, that is true, and there is a lot of debate about what's the most effective change individually. There is also some kind of deliberate manipulation, I think, by vested interests, so to kind of make a bigger deal. So yes, the carbon footprint of soy is high, for example, but it's a hell of a lot higher if that soy is fed to beef cows and then eaten by humans. So often, the lobby that's using, the reason that is being kind of publicly disseminated, that information, isn't necessarily for the most effective reasons. But yeah, I mean, that is another reason, I think, why prioritizing collective action and trying to achieve political change is particularly important, and prioritizing participatory justice, so ensuring that the decisions are made by the people who actually have experience. So, for example, with adaptation, ensuring that the sort of decisions of what to invest in and what to do have input from the people whose lives are actually at stake. So, for example, David Schlossberg, who's a political theorist in Sydney, he did some work where he was basically comparing the government's priorities when it came to adaptation with what the frontline communities who were already suffering from climate change actually wanted. And there was just this huge mismatch between the two. So I think, yeah, that's another reason to kind of really focus on participation in decision making.
And then I think there was a question around here, is there? Oh, we'll do it in order.
Can I ask a question, since it's so nearby now? Thanks. You've shown that humanity or humankind has been very unjust, both to itself as to its environment, and both now and through the ages. Can we still argue that humankind deserves to get out of this mess?
Yes. Because, and I mean, this is a big problem with using terms like all of humanity or us, or even terms like the Anthropocene, because actually, I mean, if we think about the figures from Oxfam that I quoted at the beginning, this is not all of humankind causing the problem. This is a very small proportion of humankind making things desperately bad for everyone else. So, I mean, even, which I'm not saying we should, you were going to take the line that having got into this mess, those humans who caused it don't deserve to survive, which seems a slightly draconian response anyway. But even if you were going to take that, it just doesn't apply to the rest of humanity, who, the children who are going to suffer because of climate change are not the ones who caused it. The people in the global south who are losing their homes and their lives, they're not the ones who caused climate change.
I have one question about sometimes I feel your conversation was a bit one-dimensional,
Okay.
Very much on climate change, and there are many other problems as well. I have an extreme example. What is the historic responsibility of a coal-producing and burning country like Ukraine?
Sorry, I thought you were going to say, because there's all sorts of other problems in the world, and I had a nice, neat answer. I was going to say, well, yeah, actually, I agree that this climate justice is part, or should be considered part of global justice rather than a completely separate thing. But asking particularly about Ukraine, is your point that we could not legitimately expect a state that is being so severely treated by another state to be changing things at the moment? And I think that seems entirely plausible. I mean, for different reasons, from the reasons that we would say that countries in the global south that are dependent on fossil fuels at the moment need to be supported and provided the resources to make a transition to renewables rather than being expected to do it at whatever cost to themselves. Similarly, a state that is, in the moment, having to deal with a war can't be expected to bear the costs of the transition. That doesn't mean that we don't need the transition. It just means that that would be another example of where other states need to pick up more of the tab.
So I think there was a question over here. The lady in the black top.
Thank you. So, building on the education part that someone mentioned before, how would we go about introducing the subject to people without causing extra division? Because maybe in the Netherlands there's at least a liberal consensus, even if priorities vary. But in other countries, in more conservative countries, this talk about climate change inspires defensiveness. How would we challenge that?
Okay, so I mean, I guess there are two questions. So I mean, when it comes to educating children, to some extent, that is a way of guarding against that defensiveness in the next generation. And actually, the really scary thing is the degree to which education in some places is actively swayed the other way. So the evidence on fossil fuel companies funding education in parts of the States, for example, and therefore not teaching on climate change or actively teaching climate denial is terrifying. I mean, the question of, how to get states or even potentially parents to agree to this is much more difficult. And I mean, we see that actually not the climate change example, but you see that in the UK at the moment with some parents resisting teaching around gay marriage, for example. I mean, so we do see this, and I mean, it is a hugely challenging question. I mean, part of me is tempted to kind of back out of answering it on the grounds that it's not unique to this. It's kind of a more general question about, well, what is the most effective strategy to shift towards some kind of just or more tolerant way of teaching in places that aren't. And I mean, political activism, all the sort of standard tools of political change seem like they would have a role, but I think I would want to defer to probably a social scientist, a sociologist, to know what would actually be the most effective way of doing that. I'm sorry not to have a better answer for you.
Okay, I think there was a question on this side over here.
Oh, and over here.
Oh, this was, yeah. So we'll go here and then we'll come back.
Hello.
Hi.
My name is Corné.
Nice hat.
Thank you. So you were talking earlier about the fact that if we don't have a moral framework, that the people in power, they will try to satisfy their own interests. And I'm thinking if it's possible to impart the values that we want them to have. Well, if we can impart this moral framework on the people in power, and if so, how?
Okay, so I guess there's two kind of steps here. So what I was saying at the beginning of the talk is that there's something of a perception, and I'm going to say this perhaps unfairly, that you often see this, for example, in some that say that, well, economics, for example, is completely value neutral. So there will be a claim that decisions are made for purely technical reasons or purely economic reasons or purely political reasons, and that's got nothing to do with morality, so why are you even trying to bring that in? And so I think the point I was trying to make at the beginning is to say, it's not that they have nothing to do with morality. All decisions are making some value judgments. Any policy choice makes a value judgment about what's important. So to some extent, the first step is to expose that fact and say, it's not that these are completely value neutral, it's that you are actually being swayed by, wanting to prioritize this particular group of people over another group. So that's kind of the first step. The second step is question of, well, how do we get governments to shift towards justice? Activism, when I talk about it, I mean in the broadest sense, so everything from kind of political campaigning or petitioning politicians all the way through to civil disobedience, and what individuals can most effectively do is going to depend on things like their own skill set, their own position, if they have any kind of public influence for other reasons. There's going to be people, depending on what any given individual can most usefully do, is going to depend on that. But ultimately, yes, it's going to be part of this process of activism. And I mean, there are other things that can, I think, be helpful along the way, particularly focused aims like focusing on not subsidizing fossil fuels would be a start. But also, I think, making clear and communicating the fact that this isn't this isn't just about avoiding catastrophic injustice, although it is that. It's also actually about, in many ways, creating a society that would actually be a better place to live, like a healthier, a greener society, a society with more plant-based eating, more active travel, more connection with the natural world, and less reliance on consumerism would actually, in many ways, there's plenty of evidence that it would be better for both physical and mental health. So I think more kind of communication of those win-wins might also help, certainly to sway the general public, but also to sway politicians, potentially. But I'm slightly moving out my comfort zone there because I'm a philosopher, again, not a behavioral scientist or a sociologist.
Hi. It's been slightly touched upon already, so I don't know. I'm just going to ask it anyways. I found your whole talk really interesting. But,
Thank you.
Especially the last part when you talk about getting involved in activism and that we have to create a collective action to achieve something. I think, which I'm aware, it's just always like in me that in our everyday life and based on our privileged life we have here, that we don't really, like, it might be snowing in April and might be 20 degrees in December, but that's it for now, I feel like, with climate change here. Baby, yeah. And I feel like it's really easy to get caught up in these like everyday things and to forget what you've just talked about the whole hour, that people are suffering and dying. What would you say, maybe on a social level or on your personal opinion, how can we kind of get people to feel more connected to the topic and to kind of relate it to every day, and we get people be like every day or every week or every month be like, hey, I've got to do something, and connect it more to our privileged life here in a sense of to get them to act?
Good. So, I mean, I've been thinking about this a bit because in my new book I've been thinking about, kind of how we try and move beyond these psychological obstacles that we all face, and we kind of face them collectively and we face them individually. And there are certain things that we can do, like try and bring the kind of really difficult emotions that climate change brings out. So at the moment, there's kind of a tendency to suppress all the sort of scary feelings that climate change brings out because, A, it seems like nobody else is talking about them, and B, they are just too worrying. But if we do that, then we kind of end up either in this weird double-think situation where we simultaneously know something's true and try to act as though it didn't, or we just flip all the other way and end up as a kind of fatalist or doomerist about it, which is almost as dangerous as climate denial. So I think kind of openly acknowledging and talking about those emotions would be a really good start. And I mean, one sort of really interesting thing that one of the psychologists I interviewed said was, the thing is, often people are reluctant to bring up this subject because they feel like other people aren't talking about it. But often, the other people are feeling the same. So actually kind of getting the discussion out into the open can really help. And then there are sort of strategies that you can use, again, collectively or individually, to try and reconnect with the non-human world, which actually has all sorts of mental health benefits anyway, or to try and reconnect over time. So there was the thing called Dear Tomorrow, I think it was called. It was a sort of it was an online thing, but also an installation in various cities. And the idea was that people were asked to write letters either to their children or their future children or even their future selves in 30 years' time. And that really kind of concentrated people's minds on the fact that, you're talking about yourself or your child, who's the most important person to you, and their life at that time, and sort of what will it look like. So there are kind of things that I think we can do to remind ourselves, and equally I think that there are parallel strategies for sort of trying to remind ourselves of what are the kind of more distant consequences of the decisions we make, and have those before us. But it's not easy, but it's something which is easier if we do it together, but I think that we can make a start on individually.
No? So I think this side of the room we had making you run back and forth.
Hey, thank you for your talk. And I was wondering whether you ever gave it a thought about an international justice system for the crime of polluting the environment, which has all fallen under the category or under the term of ecocide. Mm-hmm. And whether you've given a thought of this, and so this was one question.
Okay. Shall I answer that first? So yes. I mean, I'm not an expert in this, but certainly one of the ways which, as individuals or especially as groups of motivated people, using litigation is increasingly recognised as a way to try and promote change. And it will be really interesting to see, I think, over the next year or so, how things develop on that front. There are also a number of thinkers who I have a lot of sympathy with, who have argued that what we need is some kind of global citizens' assembly as a way of making decisions. Or the philosopher Stephen Gardiner has essentially said, well, what we need now is a kind of global constitutional convention to set some basic parameters for what should be expected of us wherever we are in the world in terms of protecting future generations, and that we need to sort of come together, draw that up and stick by it. So there are, I have a lot of sympathy with those sort of ideas, though I'm not an expert in them. And yes, I certainly think that litigation is one of the means that should be and will be taken to try and bring about change.
And we have time for one more question. I think there was a hand over here.
Thank you very much for your talk. So I've been feeling, I think this is also relatable for many people, that this climate anxiety and feeling depressed about the hopelessness of the situation. Do you maybe have any advice on how to deal with this feeling? Because as individuals, I feel like every good decision that I make is not enough because the destructions is happening in such a bigger scale. For example, I work in science, and the amount of plastic that I use every day in the lab, even though it's for a good deed, it's for medicine and people do need it, it's not good, And also, I was born and raised in the global south, so my hometown is quite literally right now is sinking. And I'm living in this first world country, and now I have the time to discuss all these things, but people there are I don't know, the guilt and the anxiety is just off the roof. So do you have any advice for me or for other people who feel the same?
Thank you for asking that. So yes, the phenomenon of climate anxiety is extremely real, and I think the mental health costs for younger generations of climate change is one of the many injustices that we have done to them as older generations. Again, with the caveat that I'm not a psychologist, so I'm kind of passing on things that I have read elsewhere. There does seem to be some evidence that becoming involved in activism, although not so much in letting it take over your whole life, but becoming involved in activism can actually be something that young people find helpful and positive, because it makes them feel, for a start, there's the kind of companionship and feeling of being with people who understand, but also there's the feeling of being part of a solution. So in my book, and especially in my new book, I talk a bit about the idea of kind of a difference between sort of passive hope or kind of apathetic hope, which just kind of relies on someone else solving the problem, or these incredibly difficult emotions that we face because of climate change. And there's a website which collected sort of letters from climate scientists, and I went through them looking at all the emotions that they mentioned, and there were so many, really difficult negative emotions. But there is also the possibility of kind of building a sort of active or earned hope through cooperation to tackle climate change. There is also a need for self-care, but not in the kind of commoditized, go and spend a week in a fancy spa stay. Self-care making time for oneself, one's friends, and spending time outdoors, and all the other things that are fairly obvious, but that often we don't have time to. I mean, in terms of your unique position as somebody who grew up in the global south and is having to deal with the reality of what's happening, I wouldn't have the presumption to tell you how you ought to feel, because I can't possibly know, as somebody who had the privilege of being born in the global north, what that must be like.
Okay, so I know there are more questions, but I'm afraid we will have to draw our discussion to a close there for tonight. So thank you, all of you, for coming and for your excellent questions. And would you please join me in thanking Elizabeth for a great talk?
Thank you. Thank you very much. Oh, how lovely. Oh, wow. Oh, it looks brilliant. Thank you so much. How very kind. Thank you. Thank you. So take this off.